Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our bureau here in London. On today's show, it was American Independence Day this week, which saw citizens across the transatlantic pond commemorate the approval of the Declaration of Independence in the United States by the Continental Congress on July the 4th, 1776. As a federal holiday, all non-essential federal government offices were closed on Tuesday, but that didn't stop the Republican Party presidential campaign. I'll be getting the lowdown on what's been happening in Washington from investment banker Greg Swenson, who is also the spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. And 75 years ago this week, the National Health Service was launched in the north of England. Since July the 5th, 1948, British people have been entitled to a comprehensive healthcare system, free at the point of delivery and funded by general taxation. The question is, can the institution survive to 100? I'll be asking our business correspondent Simon Pusey. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, Bank of America's President of International, Bernard Mensah, paid a visit to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu this week, alongside representatives of the bank from across the continent. During the meeting held at the presidential villa in Abuja, Mensah expressed his enthusiasm for the early measures taken by President Tinubu to enhance the nation's economy. Separately, with inflation in the country running at an 18-year high, an economist at the bank has advised the administration to increase interest rates by at least 700 basis points before the end of the year. CPI was running at 22.4% in May and is forecast to hit 30% by the end of the year, as petrol prices soar following the elimination of fuel subsidy. In African news, long-lasting injections to protect people from HIV are set to be rolled out across the continent. PrEP, an injection which provides protection from the virus for up to 2 months, is already available for free to high-risk groups in the UK. A long-lasting version of the drug called CAB-LA, currently available in America, will be rolled out across 19 African countries from 2024. A total of 38 million people live with HIV globally, and there are 1.7 million new infections per year, most of which are in women and adolescent girls in sub-Saharan Africa. This drug will be the first HIV/AIDS treatment to be rolled out in Africa. Back here in Britain, 8 weeks after he was formally crowned at Westminster Abbey, political figures and prominent representatives of public life gathered for King Charles and Queen Camilla's national service of thanksgiving and dedication. During a day of pomp, pageantry and prayer, the King was presented with the honours of Scotland, which include a crown, a sceptre and the sword of state.
In receiving this sword, I so promise by God's help.
By the symbol of this sceptre, we pledge our loyalty, entrusting you to seek the prosperity of this nation, the Commonwealth, and the whole earth.
In receiving this sceptre, I so promise by God's help.
Brandon, hereditary bearer of the Crown of Scotland, presents it to the King.
By the symbol of this crown, we pledge our loyalty, entrusting that you reign as our King in the service of all your people.
In receiving this crown, I so promise by God's help.
What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? May God give us grace to follow in this way.
Outside of the ceremony at St Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh, protesters booed and chanted, "Not my king." In other royal news, the Duke of Sussex could be awarded up to £320,000 in compensation over the alleged misuse of his private information by a tabloid newspaper publisher. Prince Harry's legal team set out its suggestions for the amount of money he could receive if a judge rules in his favour in his case against the Mirror Group newspapers. The Duke is suing MGN for damages, claiming journalists at its titles, the Daily and Sunday Mirror and Sunday People, were linked to methods charges including phone hacking, so-called blagging, or gaining information by deception, and the use of private investigators for unlawful activities. MGN is largely contesting the claims and denies that any of the articles complained of resulted from phone hacking. To Downing Street News now. Rishi Sunak hosted Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, the Prime Minister of Bahrain, at Downing Street for a bilateral meeting on Monday. The leaders welcomed the signing of a new strategic investment and collaboration partnership aimed to facilitate additional investment of more than £1 billion into the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister said the agreement marks the next chapter in the historic and close relationship between the UK and Bahrain, which spans security, defence and trade. The following day, the Prime Minister had to sit through a 90-minute session before a liaison committee who questioned him over his 5 policy priorities. Rishi Sunak was notably vague on progress over the first of the pledges to halve inflation during the year.
We remain committed to bringing inflation down, and halfway is a step on it going back down to the inflation target, which is obviously even lower than that. And now it's clearly inflation proving more persistent than people anticipated, but that doesn't mean that the plans and the policy options that have been deployed are the wrong ones. Indeed, they're the right ones, whether that's monetary policy, responsible fiscal policy or supply side reform. That's the right toolkit that you need to deploy bringing inflation down. We just need to continue to stick to the course, and that's not easy. That involves difficult decisions, but those are the right long-term decisions for the country, because if we don't do that, inflation will just get worse and last for longer, and that doesn't help anybody. Yes, of course I support the Bank of England. I mean, look, their modelling is a matter for them, and it's right that they're having that dialogue and evaluating everything that they do. But of course I support the Bank of England. The track record of the independent central bank over the past 20-25 years at keeping inflation to target has been very strong. I don't think anyone thinks we should return to a world where the government is setting interest rates. So I think it is right that they're set independently. Again, it's not easy that we bring. There are no decisions that are easy when it comes to bringing inflation down, but we have to do the things that are right for the long-term benefit of the country.
And then on Wednesday, joined by the opposition Labour Party leader Sir Keir Starmer, as well as royals, politicians, staff and patients, the Prime Minister celebrated 75 years of Britain's National Health Service.
So today, we're announcing the most ambitious transformation in the way that we staff the NHS in its history, the long-term workforce plan. This is a 15-year plan to deliver the biggest ever expansion in the number of doctors and nurses that we train, and a plan to reform the NHS so we deliver better care in a changing world, and a plan that not only eases the pressures today, but protects this precious national institution for the long term. I'd like to take some questions from the media. Can we start? The plan rests on 3 principles: train, retain, and reform. First, training. We'll double the number of medical training places by 2031, focusing on areas where there are too few doctors today. We'll train over 24,000 more nurses and midwives a year, and increase the number of GP training places by 50%. In time, this will allow us to reduce our spending on temporary agency staff by £10 billion and cut the need for international recruitment. Today, the proportion recruited from overseas is around 1 in 4. With our plan, it will fall to just 1 in 10. Second, doctors and other clinicians can spend a lifetime gaining invaluable experience. We want to hang on to those skills for as long as we can, so we'll retain more of our dedicated workforce, keeping up to 130,000 more staff in the NHS over the next 15 years. Doing that for months, so
that's an incredibly important point, because part of the reason
it's not enough just to have more doctors and nurses. We need to change the way they work so that they can deliver better care for patients. Now, partly this is about seizing the opportunities of new technologies like AI, or just look at virtual wards, which use technology to allow patients to recover at home providing a better service at lower cost.
Well, for more on this, I spoke to our business correspondent Simon Pusey in Westminster for further analysis. Simon, so on Wednesday, political figures from across the House got together to commemorate 75 years since the National Health Service was introduced in Britain. And I've got to say, despite the fact that it's in the news for all the wrong reasons over the past couple of years and even before COVID, what an amazing institution. The fact that we can just walk into a hospital, no matter what our condition, and be treated, it is something that is worthy of celebration, isn't it?
Yeah, it's worth being proud of, and we hear about it in the news a lot for the wrong reasons, that it's underfunded, the waiting times are up, that cancer survival rates aren't what they are in other countries, but it is a unique thing, really. When it was first set up in 1948, it was the first free at point of care health service in the world, and it still remains one of the sort of most respected institutions that the UK has. It makes us different to the likes of the US, other countries where you go abroad, you need huge insurance packages just in case you fall ill, and then if you do, you have to spend a lot of money. And let's not forget the advances in healthcare that it's provided the world. When it was set up in 1948, a few years later, it was the first healthcare provider to have a heart transplant, to have a liver transplant, to have a lung transplant. There's lots of things that's happened in COVID. Obviously, we saw the NHS providing the first vaccine, the first proper effective vaccine. So it still continues to make waves, and it is something that we should be proud of. And yeah, it is interesting when you go to another country, you have to think about insurance, health insurance. We have that luxury where we can go into a hospital here if anything happens to us for totally free, and we'll be looked after. Having said that, it's got a lot of issues. We've got a very aging population, more money than ever before, as Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives will keep telling us is being pumped into it, but that's not enough because of inflation and because it is a very costly thing.
Bureaucracy too.
A lot of bureaucracy and a lot of people arguing as to whether it's the right way to do things. And so it's hard to know whether it is going to last much longer. Lots of, even Tony Blair today saying we should go into privatisation more than we currently are, and everything shouldn't just be on the NHS. But it is something that we should be proud of, and I think it is something that other countries look at the UK and say, wow, imagine having something like that. And we kind of take it for granted, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, just very briefly, since I've got you away from celebrations, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak again under pressure, again inflation, institutions profiteering off the back of beleaguered Brits. The economy and the headache of it is just not going anywhere, is it?
Yeah, and there's potentially a fifth by-election coming up because we've got another MP who looks like he's probably going to have to be forced to resign. That's 5 by-elections he could lose ahead of a general election. That would be a terrible look for him. So there are lots of different things that he's got on his plate, and lots of issues. Inflation is the main one, and that's something he really can't really do himself. That's to do with the Bank of England and other economic factors. He can't really fix that, and that's one of his key 5 pledges that he's given. He promised he would. He promised he'd do that. He promised he'd stop the boats. There's lots of things on his plate at the moment, and you can understand why he's not going to Prime Minister's questions at the moment, which happened the other day, because he doesn't want these questions.
And next week too.
And he's going to be missing next week. Fair enough for a UN security conference. But yeah, there's a lot of things on his plate at the moment, and it never seems to be getting easier for him. The list of things seem to keep growing, and with all these scandals and this now 5th by-election, these are going to happen imminently in the next few weeks. Some of these by-elections. We could be here next week and the week after talking about, them losing seats to Labour in what looks like to be a big general election loss for the Conservatives at the moment.
Yes, lots of business in the Palace of Westminster. Thanks so much, Simon. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our bureau here in London. In a moment, I'll be sharing an interview I conducted with investment banker Greg Swenson. But until then, here's a breakdown of the biggest business news stories of the week. Unilever has been named an international sponsor of war by the Ukrainian government due to the firm maintaining its operations in Russia despite the Kremlin invasion. The company, which owns Marmite, Hellmann's Mayonnaise and Dove, was accused by Ukrainian veterans of contributing hundreds of millions in tax revenues to a state which is killing civilians. The consumer goods giant said last year it would review its operations in Russia. However, the company, known for taking ethical stances, has continued to sell food and hygiene products in the country, with executives from the company saying earlier this year that exiting is not straightforward. The price of Bitcoin has experienced the strongest first half of a year since 2019, nearly doubling in value since the start of 2023. The world's leading cryptocurrency reached above $31,000 this week, up from $16,000 in January. Despite the volatile sentiment across the market, the cryptocurrency's positive price trend is set to continue. Tesla has smashed delivery expectations in the second quarter by unveiling that over 466,000 units of its electric vehicle were sold during the period. The amount supersedes Wall Street expectations and is 80% higher than what was sold during this time last year. To compete with rival manufacturers, bosses cut prices to boost sales in the US, the UK and in China. The group's full financial report for the second quarter is due to be published on July the 19th. Now to our final story. It was American Independence Day this week, which saw citizens across the transatlantic pond commemorate the approval of the Declaration of Independence in the United States by the Continental Congress on July the 4th, 1776. As a federal holiday, all non-essential federal government offices were closed on Tuesday, but that didn't stop the Republican Party presidential campaign. Investment banker Greg Swenson, who is also the spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK, joined me earlier in Westminster for a deeper dive. Greg Swenson, always a pleasure having you on Channels Business Global. We're not in the studio, we're in Westminster. Unfortunately, budget wouldn't take us to Washington, but never mind, perhaps next year. It was Independence Day this week. Of course, we saw the fireworks, all of the displays, the Liberian flag crept in somewhere. Talk to me about brand America and how it's been faring this week.
I think it's still good. It will outlive any speed bumps that it hits along the way. I know there was some press about mass shootings and gun violence in cities, which is a really important issue for Americans, and especially Americans who live in those cities where violence is really out of control. In many ways, back to 1990 levels, or early 90s levels, but that shouldn't be a satisfactory answer, that it's only as bad as it was 30 years ago. Things got so much better in American cities over 30 years, and here we are back, in historic levels of violence.
I'm happy you mentioned that because, of course, we know that Joe Biden, the president, he used his Independence Day speech to speak about gun control. I think there have been 350 mass shootings this year. It's unfathomable, but it keeps on happening.
Yeah.
But is, stop the guns or, trying to have control, is that cutting through?
Well, I think, like much of what President Biden says, he likes to pick some topics that are favorable to the progressive activist left, and surely gun control is one of them. But what he doesn't tell is the truth about why there's an uplift in gun violence.
Is that?
And why is because they're not actually prosecuting the laws. More gun laws would not change anything that's happening because we have so many gun laws in place. There are restrictions on owning guns, and if you are caught committing a crime with a firearm, you used to go to jail, or at least you'd get in some deep amount of trouble with the law. Now, because of the liberal progressive left policies in these cities with the so-called Soros public prosecutors, they are just not convicting people for felonies, which, but committing a crime with a gun should be a felony. They've all been downgraded to misdemeanors. The left-leaning prosecutors in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Baltimore, they've all decided that prosecuting gun crimes is somehow racist, which is a shame because 90% of the gun violence victims are African American.
Yeah.
And it's criminal what they're doing, and it's really sad to see.
Although Tuesday was a federal holiday for most people, not really for the Republican Party. Everybody, including former President Donald Trump, was out hitting the campaign trail. A few gaffes from Donald Trump, as to be expected.
As usual.
How do you think he's faring, and what are the Republican Party's prospects like?
Well, I think the prospects are great, first of all. Secondly, the July 4th holiday, like many holidays in America, are great days for politicians to campaign. They love parades. They're public events, there's barbecues and all kinds of forums for them to campaign. So that's not surprising, that's typical, especially for the party out of power.
Yeah.
They're running a competitive campaign right now for president, whereas President Biden is running, I wouldn't say unopposed, but he's not really campaigning like you would expect an incumbent president. I think in many ways he's just too tired. It's difficult for him to get out on the campaign trail. He's done a little bit of it. As for former President Trump, he's doing the rallies again. I don't think President Trump's a great parade person or a barbecue person, but he loves his rallies, and I think that suits him very well. So you'll see a lot more of those. He did one in South Carolina the other day. But I think for the more traditional candidates and non-traditional candidates, they're out doing the parades. That's what you're supposed to do when you're running for office.
Absolutely. I would say domestically here in the UK and across Europe, they're so focused on what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. Of course, the economy is a major issue in the UK, particularly inflation and high interest rates. But there was a piece, I did send it to you earlier this week in the FT, where, you know, the writer was saying that actually Europe do not want a re-emergence of Donald Trump, and they're hedging their bets against him. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I don't think it's fair, but they also didn't really want him in 2016 either, and there was such pushback.
But it's a different world since then.
Of course it is, of course. There's a different number of risks that we didn't have 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And I think that, you know, many Europeans, especially European governments, especially left-leaning governments, are nervous about him because of what he did during his administration. He called out NATO for not properly, you know, only 7 countries in NATO are spending 2% of their GDP on defense spending. Yeah, it's come up a little bit, but it's still 1.6 on average. That's not necessarily healthy for a difficult and challenging world which we live in now. So you'd think that would have accelerated a lot more. He called out the Germans on that issue, on defense spending, as well as on dependency on Russian oil and gas back in 2018. It's interesting how that worked out. So I think in many ways, he's been right in calling out the Europeans. They don't like it, it's unpleasant. His way of delivering it is somewhat unseemly sometimes, but he turned out to be right. And remember, Ronald Reagan did this with the German Chancellor in 1982. Said basically the same thing. You're not spending enough on defense. More importantly, you're going to be dependent on Russian natural gas in 10 years. It happened in 5 years.
Just before I let you go, Greg, of course on Monday, Joe's back here, President Joe Biden back in the UK. He'll be meeting with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak as well as King Charles III.
Yeah.
Mixed reviews on his last visit to the United Kingdom. Of course, he was there for a whistle stop in the north of Ireland,
Belfast,
but then spent a lot of time in Ireland because of his ancestry. What is the mood music you're getting about this latest trip?
It's not positive. It's not good. And not only has there been this historical bias of President Biden toward Ireland, toward the EU, at the expense of the UK, he was ignoring Boris's frantic phone calls during the Afghanistan debacle, which it was. And so there's some baggage there. And then you have the fact that he blocked Ben Wallace from being the next head of NATO. That is really horrible. And I think it's going to be very difficult and unpleasant, I think, for him to be here next week.
Yes, we'll just have to wait and see how that pans out. Greg Swenson, Chair,
Thanks, Juliana.
Spokesperson of Republicans Overseas UK, also founding partner of investment firm Rick McAdam. Thanks for your time
Great
today.
to be here. Thank you.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.